I on? Good morning. So this is unprecedented territory for us, and hello to the small groups out there and everybody watching online. Father, we just pray as we go into this time of worship that you would have your hand upon us, God. Unite us in spirit, though we're not united in body. Thank you for this time. Thank you for the ability to come together this way. We praise you. Can't go back to the beginning. Can't control what tomorrow will bring. But I know here in the middle is a place where you promised to be. I'm not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? As I walk now through the valley, let your love rise above everything, like the sun shaping the shadow. In my weakness, your glory appears. I'm not enough unless you is all you are. Will you meet me here again? I'm not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? Not for a minute was I forsaken. The Lord is in this place. The Lord is in this place. Come, Holy Spirit, dry bones awaken. The Lord is in this place. The Lord is in this place. Not for a minute was I forsaken. The Lord is in this place. The Lord is in this place. Come, Holy Spirit, dry bones awaken. The Lord is in this place. The Lord is in this place. Not enough. I'm not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? I'm not enough unless you come. Will you meet me here again? 'Cause all I want is all you are. Will you meet me here again? Father, we ask that you would meet us here where we are. We're so grateful for your presence. Bless this time and bless the word in Jesus' name. Amen.
Looking into the camera right now. So I was telling my wife Pat this morning on the drive over here, I said it's almost going to feel like a Friday morning for me, because Friday, or rather a Friday afternoon, Friday morning I come here, I get everything tightened up for the message on Sunday, and then I come out here in the afternoon and I preach to empty chairs so I can kind of get acclimated to the way I think the Holy Spirit is going to have me deliver the message on Sunday. And so I'm not speaking to empty chairs. There's a few of us here that are making this thing happen today, and so I'm very thankful for everybody. I'd like to say hello to all the small groups out there, and here's what I'd like for you to do right now, because you guys can't stay off your phones, man, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to get on your phone right now. And what I want you to do is take your phone out and take a selfie, right? Because y'all like to take selfies, y'all like to take pictures of yourselves. And I want you to post it on your Facebook page and tag the Refuge, right? Show people we're still having church today. Even though we're trying to stay within this public mandate that's out there. You cannot stop the body of Christ from meeting. And man, we're back to the days of Acts where we're meeting in homes and stuff. It's so cool. So super excited about that. We're going to continue our study of the book of Psalms. And we're going to be in Psalm chapter 6 today. Primarily, we're going to be in verse 9. Now, this psalm was written near the end of David's life in approximately 1015 BC. And when David had penned this psalm, Solomon had been anointed as the king. He had been brought forth. David he gave a decree to Israel and to the priests and to the military. This is the man, you're to follow him like you followed me. And so David had been king for 40 years. And in that 40-year period, David had experienced some real triumphs. He had made Israel into a great nation. He conquered their enemies. The nation prospered. It was one of the most prosperous nations on earth at the time, and it was going to continue to prosper under Solomon. And most of all, David honored the Lord. And Israel was in a time when it was honoring the Lord while it was under David's reign. David loved God. But in all that, David also had sorrow. He still failed on several occasions. David blew it. Remember, a lot of you know this, but I want to go through the annals of history with David. He had an affair with Bathsheba, a married woman. When he found out that Bathsheba was pregnant, he had Uriah, who was one of his mighty men, killed in battle so he could cover up the fact that he had had an affair and that Bathsheba was pregnant because of David. On top of that, he hid the fact of this marital affair until it was revealed by Nathan the prophet. Nathan came out and said, hey, look, dude, I'm going to give you a story. And in this story, I want you to give me the answer to how this should be handled. And so he gives this story, and in the end, David says, well, that man should be killed. And David's told by Nathan, well, that man is you. And then immediately David's heart was struck with conviction. And David fell on his face and repented. And within a few weeks, he had penned Psalm 51, which is one of the most beautiful psalms that have ever been written. David also took a census of the people. God said, don't number the people. Don't worry about how big your nation is. Don't worry about how big your army is. I'm bigger. Rely on me. But David took a census anyways. And in the end, it cost 70,000 lives in Israel. He lied on several occasions and justified his lies. He lied to the priest when he got Goliath's sword and he took the showbread. But through all of this, through all the failure, listen, church, you got to understand, David was still a man after God's own heart. He was chasing after God. And so now David has been alive on this earth for 70 years. And he begins reflecting back on his life. And he pens this psalm. So, as I said, we're going to be in chapter 6. Verse 9 is the focus of this. We will tie in verse 9 with some other verses in this psalm. But verse 9 is a beautiful, beautiful verse. And it reads, "The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord accepts my prayer." So, Lord, as we go into this time of looking at your word, I pray that we'd be receptive, that we'd be open, Lord. Even though we're spread out in Sassoon and in 2 different spots in Vacaville, Lord, we know that the same Spirit binds us together and teaches us. So I pray, Father, that you would help me this morning to only speak, Lord, what you tell me to speak. And Father, that I could get out of the way, Lord. I could get out of the flesh and out of my own desires, Lord, and And Father, that you could use me today. I pray for my brothers and sisters, Lord. I pray that the things that are warring against them, that right now are keeping them from hearing you, God, that, Lord, that they would lay them at your feet, Father, and that they would be freed up. We desire to be taught this morning. We desire to be changed because we've been in your presence, Lord. And so sweep away everything, sin, lies, deceit, whatever's there, Lord, take it from us. And may we be vessels that can be poured into for your honor and glory in Jesus' name. Amen. So verse 9, David writes, the Lord has heard my plea. The Lord has heard my plea. Now, here's the thing. We know that this is at the end of David's life when this psalm is penned. And in reading the psalm, it may appear that David was in a trial, and he could have been in a trial. We're not quite sure. But whether he was in a trial, whether he was reflecting on his life, maybe the things that he had done wrong, David pens these words that I believe we need to grasp this morning and understand. The Lord has heard my plea, and the Lord accepts my prayer. So what does it mean here when David says, the Lord has heard my plea? Well, this word in the Hebrew means to cry out for grace. So David was crying out for grace here. Maybe he was reflecting on the failures that we had talked about earlier with Bathsheba and the census and the lies and all that. Maybe he was in a last moment of his life where there was a trial that was coming against him. There was those who were adversarial towards him when he anointed Solomon. We're not quite sure. But for whatever reason, David here says, the Lord has heard my plea. He's heard my cry for grace. Some of us this morning are crying out for grace. We're saying, Lord, I need grace in this situation. I need your grace. I'm at the breaking point. I don't understand what's going on. Lord, I'm in fear over this coronavirus and all that. I don't know what's warring against you. But listen, David said, the Lord has heard my plea. Church, cry out to God for grace. The Lord will hear your plea this morning. If you go back to verses 6 through 8 in this psalm, David says this. He says, I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eyes waste away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. These are some deep verses here, church. This is a heartfelt cry to God. Have you ever been so weary in a trial? Have you ever been so exhausted from crying out and just moaning and hurting and just, Lord, I can't take it no more? Have you ever been in that position in your life? I have. I know that feeling. Well, man, I'm just like, I'm tore up. Every night I flood my bed with tears. Have you cried yourself to sleep over your situation? Have you just laid in bed and just tears rolled down your face because you just don't understand or you just don't know what the outcome is going to be because your life is in turmoil? David says, I drench my couch with my weeping. I mean, even when he was sitting, even when he was on his couch, he was crying, he was weeping before God. And then he says something very interesting in verse 7. He says, my eyes waste away because of grief. His eyes wasted away because of grief. David wept so much before the Lord that as if his eyes were just wasting away. All he could see was tears. I like what Charles Spurgeon wrote. He said, David's eyes were red and sore from all the tears and lack of sleep. As an old man's eyes grow dim with years, so says David, my eyes have grown red and feeble through weeping. through weeping. There's something about shedding tears before the Lord. I don't know what it is. I mean, I think about the shortest verse in the Bible. It says Jesus wept when he was weeping over Jerusalem and over Lazarus. And I don't know. You know, we're in a society, or at least I grew up in a society where if a man shed a tear, I mean, he was weak. He was. But I look at this mighty man of God, this warrior of God, who wept before the Lord, who loved God so much that to just be in His presence, it just brought tears. Have you ever been in that place? There are times, church, I'm telling you, man, I'm going to try not to move around too much because I was told to keep within the camera. But this is real hard for me because I like moving around. There's times when I have just been so overwhelmed by the presence of God. I've shared with you guys a few times how my backyard is my domain. That's my place, right? Even Mama Bear don't own that. Well, she kind of does, but anyways, but that's my domain. And I love being back there, and I love to go out there in the morning and have my cup of coffee, bring out the Word, and just sit there and just watch the sun come up and look at we got like a lot of, you know, birds and squirrels and rabbits and all sorts of stuff that live behind my house. And I just look at God's creation, and then I'll just sense this overwhelming presence of the Lord, because I think it's because I'm sitting still and I'm quiet and I'm waiting on God, and He just comes and He just overwhelms me, and I just begin to cry. I can relate to David so much, man. I'm a weeper. I weep before the Lord. I can be real sensitive. Then the next moment I could want to chop your head off. I mean, it's maybe I'm bipolar. I don't know, but there's just something about shedding tears before God. Pastor Scott Hubbard said something interesting. He said, "Not one sparrow falls to the ground apart from God's notice, and neither does one of your tears." God notices every one of our tears. And many times in the Bible, we see God respond to our tears. Genesis 21:15 through 17. Now, Hagar had been Sarah's handmaiden, and God had promised Abraham and Sarah that they were going to have a child, but they were very advanced in age. In fact, Abraham was 99 years old, and Sarah was 89 years old, and God promises him this child, this boy that was going to be born, Isaac. And of course, like what we all do, we think that we need to help God in situations. And so it wasn't happening as quickly as they thought it should. And so Sarah says, "Hey, I got a bright idea. Why don't you go ahead and sleep with Hagar, your handmaiden? She can produce this heir." And Abraham, like any dumb guy, is like, "Cool, that sounds great. I'll do it. Let's go." And so they have this child. But then Hagar, having this child, changes Sarah's heart, and Sarah becomes angry, disenchanted, and she doesn't want Hagar around anymore because Abraham is showing favor to this child. And so Abraham is trying to reason with his wife, and she says Hagar needs to go. And so Hagar and her son flee into the desert. And it's here where we pick up our story in Genesis 21:15. It says, "When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went out and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, 'Let me not look on the death of my child.' And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice, and she wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is at.'" Hagar sheds these tears. She cries, she weeps. And in that weeping, God moves. He says, "Look, I hear the boy. I hear this child. You're weeping and the torment that you're in. I get it. I hear this. I'm not going to let your child die. This is what God's saying when he says, I heard the boy. I'm not going to abandon him. And he says to Hagar, he prophesies that this boy is going to turn into a great nation. And so God responded to the cry of this woman Hagar. In 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 10 through 17, we see the beautiful story of Hannah. Hannah was barren. She could not have children. And she was tormented with this. And she wanted a child desperately. And she was married to Elkanah. And he was a righteous man. But he also had another wife. Peninnah was her name. And she used to torment poor Hannah all the time. Ha ha, you don't have no kids. I'm the favored one because I've got the kids. And it broke Hannah's heart. And Elkanah, he would give her a double portion because he felt so bad for her when they would go to the sacrifices. And because he loved her. And even though the Lord had closed up her womb, he still loved her very much. And so she was distraught. She was at the feast, and she walks away. And in verse 10, we pick up our story. It says, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. So we see there in verse 10, it says that she wept bitterly. She was weeping before God. It continues on, as she continued praying before the Lord, weeping and praying, Eli observed her. Eli was the priest. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips were moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli took her to be a drunken woman, and Eli said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. But Hannah said, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. Oh, she was troubled. She says, I have drank neither wine nor strong drink, but I am being poured out my soul. But I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Have you ever poured your soul out before God? Have you ever been so distraught, in so much distress, in so much pain, that you just poured your soul out to God? It's like, God, this is it. Take me. Verse 16 says, do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And then Eli answered, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And I'm going to read 18. And she said, let your servant find favor in your eyes. And the woman went away her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. And as we know, Hannah ended up having a child, Samuel, who was going to be the greatest prophet in the land. God responded to her cry. See, sometimes we have to be broken before God can respond. Because if we're not broken, then somehow we take credit for whatever happens. Oh, well, that was my doing. That was my thing. That was my gift. No, it's God. And brokenness, it has a way of causing God to respond. And when he sees those tears, real tears, not the tears that we sometimes shed like, I got caught, like your kids, when they get caught and they start crying and stuff. No, we're talking real tears like, Lord, I'm sorry. I'm worthless. I don't know what I'm doing. God, I just need you. Man, God will respond to those tears. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 5. Hezekiah had been prophesied to by Isaiah that he was going to die. Isaiah said, get your house in order, dude, you're dying. And so it says that Hezekiah turned towards the wall and he began to weep before the Lord. And then the Lord speaks to Isaiah and says, turn back and say to Hezekiah, the leader of my people, Thus says the Lord, the God of David, your father, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your, what? Tears. Behold, I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. Hezekiah rolled himself to the wall and began to weep and pray to the Lord. Hezekiah was a good king. He loved the Lord. And Hezekiah had made a mistake that the Lord says, well, that's going to cost you. You're going to have to die. But he heard Hezekiah's prayer. He saw the repentant tears. He saw the tears of brokenness in Hezekiah. And he tells Isaiah, go back and straighten this out. Oh, our tears have a way of moving the Lord. And then, of course, here in verses 6 through 9, we see that David has been weeping. He's moaning. His bed is full of his tears. His couch is wet from his weeping. His eyes have wasted away because of this grief, right? And he says in verse 8, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. Let me tell you something, church. You need to understand this and write this down right now if you got a pen and paper. When David became weary with moaning, God didn't become weary with listening. That's profound. Because there's people that say, oh no, I can't keep coming to God with this. Or I can't keep bothering God with this. He's just too busy. He's just too big. And no, that's not true. God never wearies when we come to Him. He never wearies. He's not going, oh my gosh, not him again. Oh my goodness, not her. Do I got to listen to her voice again? That's not what God's doing. That's not who He is. No, He doesn't become weary with listening. He wants to listen. He is listening, and He's taking it in. He's hearing you. But it takes faith to believe that. And one of the coolest verses in the Bible is Psalm 56:8. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Think about that. God keeps count. He keeps count of your tossings. He keeps, every time you toss and turn, every time He keeps count. And it says, put my tears in the bottle. God literally puts tears in a bottle. These are your tears. Are they not in your book? Somewhere in a book in heaven, I don't know where it's at, but there is a book that says, this is every single tear that you shed while you were on earth. And maybe it's going to be a reminder for us when we are in heaven, when the new heaven and earth have been formed, and there are no more tears, there is no more pain, there is no more sorrow. We'll be able to look back and go, my gosh, Lord, even in that time when my tears were falling, you were still good. You were still good. And now look at me. I have no more tears anymore because I'm in your presence forever. This is such a beautiful verse in the Bible. Write that verse down. Cling to that verse. God cares. He counts my tossings. He puts my tears in a bottle. Oh my goodness. I probably have jars. I'm such a crybaby sometimes. Here's the beautiful thing about what David said here. The Lord has heard my plea. David knew God had heard the sound of his weeping, and he states, the Lord heard my plea. He knew it. It says here at the end of verse 8, for the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. God hears the sound of our weeping this morning, church. He hears it. He hears it. Oh, goodness, could we just believe that God hears it? The second thing in this verse is that it says, the Lord accepts my prayer. So not only does He hear our prayers, hear our weeping, but He accepts our prayers. But what does that really mean? What is David saying here? The Lord accepts my prayer. Well, the word here for accept is the word in Hebrew called lakach. Lakach. It's kind of a weird name. Now, this word is used 965 times. And it's got many, many different meanings in the original language. This is why it's so important that we study and that we just don't read the concordance and pick out what we want out of it. Well, that sounds like what it is. You have to read it and line it up with whatever that verse is. It takes time. But here, this word, the thought behind this word is one who receives something in their hand. That's what this word means. It means something that's being received, like handing something off, and the person is receiving it. And so David is telling us here that the Lord is receiving my prayer into his hand. Think about that. God takes hold. Make sure I'm in the video. God takes hold of the prayer. He grabs it. He takes hold of it. He takes ownership of it. He accepts it. And here's the cool thing. When you think about what is being said there in the language, it's like it's in God's hands now. My prayer is in God's hands now. And David knew whatever the outcome, that God firmly had it in his grip. God wasn't surprised. God wasn't scratching his head. No, he takes our prayers. He accepts our prayers. He takes them into his hands. And when our prayers are in his mighty hands, church, we have nothing to fear. We have nothing to worry about because God is in control. You know, President Trump a couple of days ago declared today as a national day of prayer. And I saw a report this morning on a secular news website. And this is what it read. Amid coronavirus, we have one big quiver in our arsenal. Prayer. Prayer. Everybody's panicking. Everybody's worried. Listen, like I said the other day in the little video message I sent out, I'm not downplaying this virus. This virus can be very deadly to people, right? But church, we belong to Jesus. And so as people who are connected to God, we should be praying. And today's not the first time we've seen a national day of prayer being called. Throughout history, presidents have called on our nation to pray. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, asked for the nation to pray for an end to slavery and the war that was dividing our country. When Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941, President Roosevelt had a national day of prayer as we were gearing up to go into a war that was going to last for 4 years. When 9/11 happened in 2000, the president called for a national day of prayer. And here, listen, I wasn't around in 1941, but I was around in 2000, right? And I remember churches being filled to the brim because of 9/11. Kind of funny how churches can't fill up over this one. Because the mandates are out. No big public gatherings, none of this, none of that. The enemy's crafty. Now let's keep the people separated. Thank goodness for technology. Here's what I want you to understand this morning as I close. Even the heathen knows how to pray in a crisis. There were people in 9/11 that I knew were not believers that were praying to God for our nation. The heathen knows how to pray in crisis. Church, how much more should we know how to pray to God who are intimate with Him? We have a relationship with Him. Prayer is our lifeline. Prayer was David's lifeline. No matter what David was going through, prayer was the lifeline. And as I stated, David knew that God held his life in His mighty hand. And he cried out in faith. And he knew that the Lord would honor his plea and accept it. So the question I have for you this morning is, do we have that kind of faith? Do we have the kind of faith in our prayer life that, you know what, I believe God is going to hear my cry for grace. He's going to accept my prayer. Now listen, let me just be real clear. Just because God accepts it doesn't mean you're going to get the outcome that you want. When God accepts the prayer, when we place it in God's hands, we give it to God. We say, this is you, God. I'm placing it in your hands. Then we have to be willing for the outcome. If you're praying for something out of God's will, it's not going to happen. God's not going to do it. He's not going to do it. No, church. We need to have the faith that David had this morning in verse 9. That his plea was heard and his prayer was accepted. And that God was going to be in control of my life. If we can grasp those truths this morning, no coronavirus, no financial crisis, nothing can stand against us, because we will be standing in the shadow of God's wings. Amen. Father, thank you for this morning. We thank you for your love and your grace. I pray, God, that you would just bless us today, Father. Thank you for the ability for us to do what we did, to have the small groups, to be able to do a live feed. And Father, we're just amazed at how you can circumvent man's ways. Thank you, Father, that you love us and you care for us. May you bless us the rest of this day and the rest of this week in Jesus' name. Amen. So a couple of things, small groups before, don't shut off yet. A couple of things. Reminders, Tuesday night, canceled. No Tuesday nights until this thing kind of settles down. Wednesday night, small groups will continue. The Wednesday nights, small group will be going through the whole book of Psalm, or the whole chapter of Psalm chapter 6. We don't know how long this is going to last. Our timeline is that we want to be back here in the fellowship by April 5th, which is Palm Sunday. That's kind of the goal. We're praying that that's what's going to happen. Of course, we don't know what's going to transpire over the next couple of weeks. So, small group leaders, stay in touch with your people. Always remember that we're going to be updating the website with updates on what's going on. You can check the Facebook page. And we're going to try to do our best to communicate with you. Also, if you have Alpha bottles, I need to get them back. Alpha Pregnancy is wanting the bottles, and so we want to get them to them because it's money that they need in order to sustain their ministry. So if you could arrange a time to bring them by the church, you can call and leave a message on the church voicemail. You can email me. I'm going to be here. I'm going to keep my regular office hours to the best of my ability. So, Alpha baby bottles. Also, tithe. I mean, we're not here to be able to receive the tithes and the offerings. And so, a couple of ways that you can do that if you want to continue to give to the ministry. You can go online to our website and you can hit the donate button and you can donate through there. You can drop the tithe off here at the office, or you can give it to your small group leader. And the small group leaders will receive the tithe, and then they'll get it to us so that we can get it deposited, and then we can continue to pay for our bills and things like that. So anyways, have a fantastic week, and look forward to seeing those who are in the small groups on Wednesday night. We look forward to seeing you all, and God bless.